Welcome to the lecture 20 of the lecture series, Psychology of Well-Being. Well, in the trilogy of the lectures, we have already completed two that began from lecture 18. And these three lectures focus on well-being in the Indian socio-historical context. In the first of these three lectures, we saw how in the Buddhist era, the Indian socio-historical context shaped the experience or conceptualization of well-being from the point of view of Buddhist perspective. Then in the previous lecture, which is the second one in the trilogy, we saw how the Dharma tradition and Mughal period, besides the British period, how the Indian socio-historical context shaped the notions and experiences of well-being. And in this lecture, we are going to look at how the post-independence socio-historical context have shaped the experience of well-being in the Indian context. So we are going to begin with recapitulating relational and hierarchical aspects of, well-being in the Indian context. That would be followed by hierarchy of caste and patriarchy in the post-independence era and the struggle for well-being related to that. Then we'll be looking at relational self and well-being despite these hierarchies, how these have been negotiated or attempted by communities or people. So intra-community relationship and inter-community relationships with reference to Bhakti movement and the Hindu festivals in general, or even festivals of other religion. And then, as we have the limited time, we would also briefly touch the modernity and globalization in the contemporary times, even in the 21st century, its positive and negative effects on well-being. And finally, we'll be touching that how Dharma tradition or the religious spiritual traditions are even today informing or influencing the experiences of well-being of people in the Indian context. So a push towards autonomous self, despite and besides that, beg your pardon, well-being being influenced by the Dharma tradition, which we observed in the previous lecture. So recapitulating relational and hierarchical aspects, as we have seen earlier throughout the Indian socio-historical context that we traced from the ancient times to the contemporary times in this particular lecture. So importantly, as we have observed, there have been strong indications of egalitarian or progressive as well as exclusionary or divisive ways in which the spiritual, beg your pardon, religious spiritual traditions have been used in shaping well-being as well as struggles for that among the Indians. Well, caste system in various religious groups has been an example of these uh, hierarchies into which people live their lives, despite being influenced by the religious spiritual traditions in various era of Indian socio-historical context. So hierarchy of caste and patriarchy, we see that the ethnographic studies of 1950s and 60s, ethnographic studies again focus on the study of cultures. So Indian culture in 1950s and 60s, these studies highlighted the social order that defined Indian culture or society. And it told us about the castes, the presence of castes that influenced the sense of well-being or the struggles for that, and these were marked by being community-based. Endogamous would mean again that the marriages could be possible within the community, and the castes were also taken to be hereditary, which means that by birth one inherits a particular caste. By virtue of being born in a particular family that belongs to a particular caste, you also happen to be assigned the same caste. Rituals or internalized duties that could rarely be deviated from. So the caste also meant that there were certain rituals or internalized duties that the members had to perform and not deviate from. And the notions of pollution and purity. Again, it would mean that particularly the castes that considered themselves to be the higher ones or more dominant ones, they thought themselves to be purer, and other castes that were not as dominant or not belonging to the higher caste, they were taken to be not as pure or they were taken to be polluted. So, this is something that we saw earlier in the earlier lecture, that how in the Rig Veda, Varna or caste was never assigned to be the one that is based on one's birth, but it was based on occupation. But gradually, by first millennium current era, it started getting understood or practiced as inherited, or by birth one actually gets the category of caste, category of a particular caste. Okay, so as per the literature, in the first couple of decades after independence, India witnessed polarity in terms of access to resources that are considered important for people's well being. For example, higher castes had a far greater share of resources such as landed property, crops, etc. And these studies have pointed out that lower castes or scheduled tribes, consisting of about 70% of population, were generally landless or resourceless. There were, they were, I beg your pardon, there is one typographical error here. They were a deprived lot that was exploited and discriminated, that often led them to struggle for their well being. Now, besides the caste, there were gender relations that were also lopsided, that were also hierarchical. And these hierarchies were supported by the patriarchal norms or gender related norms. And patriarchal norms would mean that the norms that would favor the higher position or perceived higher position of males, or the dominance of males, that was something that was subscribed to. So that is patriarchal norms. So, for example, number of male children was given the general criteria for women to feel some self-worth. So, how many male children that a woman has would decide whether or not she can be taken in a high esteem or not. More the male children, greater the self worth of the women. The cliched images of patriarchy in India, as Clark Desi and Mark 2017 have pointed out, and I quote them: the senior man of the household, whether father, grandfather, or uncle, typically was the recognized family head, and his wife was the person who regulated the tasks assigned to female family members. Men enjoyed higher status than women, boys were often pampered, whereas girls were relatively neglected, and women were expected to treat their husbands as if they were gods. Moreover, women did not own property in their own names, nor did they inherit parental property. This is 1950s and 60s, and partly Indian society has progressed, but we still see traces of, or maybe some people would argue that to a great extent these patriarchal norms are even present even today, although these are being contested far more than what it used to be in 1950s and 60s. Well, despite these hierarchies of caste and gender, relational notions of self and well-being could be also experienced by people. How? Well, social respect or safeguarding and nurturing one's own and family reputation and worth or izzat continues to be an important concern for people's sense of well-being. So one's well-being being associated with the reputation and worth of the family and not just individual reputation or individual accomplishments. However, this could also be a source of dilemma or conflict for people in pursuing some individual goal that might not be in accordance with the family's reputation. The other important element of relational self, or example of relational self and well being, could be this that primacy to relational network or family was something that was a shared meaning, that has been a shared meaning in the Indian society. So, for example, local spirit healers, and I quote Clark Desi and Mark once again, local spirit healers, I beg your pardon, Oja or Bhagat, invariably use family therapy to demonstrate that an affliction seemingly the property of one family member diagnosed there as invasive spirits is shared with the entire family and not just with the individual. So the spirits that were considered to be afflicting the person, it doesn't influence only the person but also the entire family. No specific individual in the family is guilty of his or her own dysfunctionality. Rather, the affliction, healing, and consequent well being are the property of all members of the family in equal measure. So, this is again not just 1950s or 60s, but even today's time, we find that these could be very much prevalent in the Indian context. Well, we have some images of relational processes that counter these hierarchies. The one example is turning to religion for community as well as personal well being, prevalent amongst all the religious groups or most of the religious groups. For example, good rain for the entire community, village, or region, health, safety, material gains for one's own family members, and spiritual pursuits. So these were something that were not only present in just one religion or caste, but this could be present in most of the religions and caste groups. The other example is multi-religious participation in the religious events of a different religious group. So, for example, I'm a Hindu, so or a Christian, whether or not I participate in the religious events of the other religion. So here is one example that how such participation is still evident, and that tells us that in religious hierarchies may not be the entire truth. There could also be a sense of harmony there that has been evidenced. A Hindu villager who never joins in daily prayers or namaz at a mosque may readily make an offering at a tomb of a local Muslim saint and ask the spirit to cure his child. And again, I'm quoting Clark Desi and Mark, their work published in 2017. A good example of this multi-religious participation is the Dargah or the shrine of famous Sufi saint of Chishti order, Hazrat Zamuddin Aulia, whose love for of God has served as an inspiration across religious boundaries for centuries. So this is another example of how the relational or more harmonious processes countered or has been countering the hierarchies of religion. Then we have another example of how the gender based hierarchies have also been countered, and we have had some evidence of that from studies conducted even in 60s. So celebrating Holi, the Hindu festival, for example, Citing the study by Marriott in Uttar Pradesh, Clark Decian Smith noted that the Spring Festival of Love, the entire community joined together to play, chase, and color each other with the dyes, mud, and even cow dung, regardless of gender or caste. So we find that these caste boundaries are uh, mm, also somewhere countered in such festivals symbolically. Also, as described about the Braj district in Uttar Pradesh, two of the many villages in the region feature a ritual of role reversal in which gender powers and privileges of relative lack thereof are reversed. For one day of the 4 day festival, men behave passively and women of any caste are permitted to curse any man, including their husbands, play pranks on them, and chase them through the village with sticks and cudgels, often beating them black and blue. All the victims of the festival temporarily adopt a role of inferiority in a spirit. So that's another example of countering the hierarchies through more relational processes that are a part of these festivals too. We move on to the contemporary times or the modern times, post 1990s, and we find that globalization entering the Indian context, and there have been positive effects of that besides negative. Reports of an economic development in the post-economic globalization period since 1990s is something that has been quite evident. Clark Destian Smith also reported that about 100 million people moved above the poverty line after 1990s globalization in India. However, recalling Sunil Bhatia's studies that we looked into in our lecture 2, the second lecture in this lecture series, we could find that the contemporary study of Sunil Bhatia, also told us about the negative effect of economic or neoliberal globalization. And he talked about value conflicts among the middle class youth. So globalization might bring in opportunities, but those opportunities were ingrained in the alien Western concepts of self and well-being. So that has led to value conflicts amongst the middle class youth. Then deepening of the sense of deprivation among the poorer youth. Poorer youth. That was another example of how negative impact of globalization has been there. And then finally, migration and uprootedness in the name of opportunities. That is something that has been very much evident in COVID-19 pandemic, migration and reverse migration that it has led to. Well, finally, we find that Clark Dacey's analysis tells us that dharma tradition that tells us about um, our basic spiritual nature and our pursuit towards the relational harmony, although Dharma tradition also was misinterpreted in terms of caste hierarchies or mispracticed in terms of caste hierarchies, yet we find that it also has had positive impact on people's well-being in terms of um, making them somewhere internalize the relational or spiritual elements of one's existence. We find that because of globalization, there has been indications of rise in notions of autonomous self rather than the relational self. However, beyond the individual opportunity for economic gain and ambition or status, as observed above, Sunil Bhatia also reported conflicts of values, I beg your pardon. However, despite these encroachments of modernity, well being in India continues to make sense only in relation to historically situated structures, as Clark Dacey and Mark have repeatedly pointed out, and I quote them here also. And these historically situated structures of persons and their relationship in the Indian world may be changing, because perceptions and experiences of well-being and quality of life on the subcontinent are not immutable. They may have been compromised by modernity and globalization, but they remain distinctive. So that is again something that we need to understand, that despite the effects of modernity, well-being in India still gets guided by the historically situated notions of person, which are religious, spiritual in nature, relational in nature, and these structures might have undergone some change, but such perceptions of relational and spiritual aspects of human self and well-being on the subcontinent are not taken to be, or there have been evidences that these continue to remain more or less unchanged. And although these might have been a bit compromised by modernity and globalization, but they still remain distinctive, very much present, very much making Indian people realize their relational or spiritual aspect of their self and well being. Thank you very much.